нас в гостях президент Вінніпезького університету, колега. Щойно ми підписали угоду про співпрацю між нашими навчальними закладами. Ллойда Ексуорсі, президент університету Вінніпега.
Well, good morning, everybody. Can you all hear me? Good. Let me begin by thanking you for the really impressive description of your school and what you're doing, and to say that I'm pleased that my own government of Canada was in some ways responsible when I was Foreign Minister of Canada in the late 90s. One of the contributions we made to the new Ukraine was to establish the public administration program. So it's always nice to come back and see what wonderful results have been obtained. So I feel it was all worthwhile. I'm going to talk this morning about an idea. Now, you may think that's a contradiction in terms from someone who spent close to 30 years in politics and government, and the last 10 years as a university administrator. As my Aboriginal friends in Canada would say, it's important for you to carry the talking stick, which means you tell the truth. I don't have my talking stick with me, but I will do my best. And the idea really is the way in which there is an emerging, increasingly powerful set of laws, agreements, standards, norms, actions, conventions on the basis of human rights. Let me give you the background to that. Yesterday morning, just after I arrived, I had the occasion to visit the Museum of the Holodomor. I wanted to visit because in my own city of Winnipeg, we are building probably the world's largest new museum of human rights. And one of the important exhibits will be what happened in Ukraine in the 1930s and in the early 40s to wipe out large millions and numbers of people through the use of starvation. And the young woman who was taking us around the museum happened to mention the name of Raphael Lemkin. Is that name familiar to anybody here? Well, Raphael Lemkin is one of my heroes. When I was a student at Princeton University back in the 60s, I just gave away my age, Raphael Lemkin really symbolized the emergence of a whole system of thought around the importance of human rights. Raphael Lemkin was a lawyer from Poland. He escaped in the late 30s because of the increasing encroachment of the Nazis from Germany. His own life was in danger because he was Jewish. He ended up settling at Duke University in the United States, where he established a small group of researchers that began to very carefully register the number of people and from where the Holocaust was taking place. Jews, Romans, those who had different sexual preferences, criminal dissidents. I think you all know the story. Lemkin, like many when they found out, was horrified. he was equally horrified because the governments of the time, the governments who were waging the Second World War on the western side, knew about it but wouldn't speak about it. It became, as Winston Churchill called it, the crime that has no name. And they tolerated the murder of 6 to 7 million people, which when you add to the 3 or 4 million that were killed here in Ukraine earlier and were to follow afterwards, and as the issue of genocide began to emerge as one of the most unsavory practices of the last part of the 20th century, Lemkin and his students from university began to wage a campaign to have the United Nations eventually establish a convention on genocide that declared the deliberate political purpose of exterminating, killing, ethnically cleansing a group of people simply because who they were to be an international criminal crime. In 1948, the Convention on Genocide was passed. It was, for all of us, regardless of your political opinion, a hallmark decision because it established for the first time an international standard that public officials, prime ministers, foreign ministers, generals, can and should be tried publicly for any attempt to murder their own fellow citizens, or those who happen to be other innocent citizens of other states. It was an incredible and far-sighted decision taken by the early members of the United Nations to actually agree to such a convention. The outcome was not so happy. The convention was signed just about the same time the Cold War was starting, and at that point in time, East and West were not interested in the protection of people. They had their own national strategy, they had their own issues of geopolitical power. It was a matter of dividing the world into different spheres of influence. And Raphael Lemkin and his dream of an international law was forgotten for a long time. It's only when the wall came down and the Cold War came to an end that there was a chance for a resurgence, a renaissance of the idea itself. And I can speak to that personally because I was the Foreign Minister of Canada at the time. And like many of you, always searching, to use the wonderful words that I just heard, ways of changing the country to better the results for the citizens of that country. And what we discovered is that all the old conventions and ways of doing things that we had practiced during the Cold War, and this is probably talking ancient history to you, it didn't work anymore. The way that we looked at the world through the lens that had been established for 30 or 40 years just didn't make sense of the world we looked at. It was like Galileo looking through the wrong end of the telescope. It didn't really tell us what the reality of the world was about. So, myself and my officials, people who were in a position like you will be someday, we sat down and said, so let's for a moment break out of the box. Let's decide what kind of lens do we want to look through the world. What is our mission as a country? What would we think would be the best way to try to serve our citizens who had elected me in government and they into the public service? And we came up with the concept of human security. And remember that because that's the idea I'm talking about. Human security is very simple to say. It is basically to take the fundamental acceptance of the human right of every individual to survive, to exist, to prosper, and do everything possible to protect that right against the risks that were formulated by others. And so we really dedicated ourselves to finding out where in our various actions, transactions, we could discover ways in which we would not be basing our policies on realpolitik, flexing military muscles, economic and trade. Those are all very important, of course, and our Prime Minister was very active. But at the same time, we made as part of our mission human security, protection of people. And I won't spend a lot of time because we could be here for a couple of days to get the full story, but the most initial opportunity that presented itself is that a group of NGOs, civil society groups, had emerged at the beginning of the 90s around the issue of landmines. And why? Because landmines were a killer of innocent people. They were no longer a military weapon of any utility. They were the kind of things that stuck in the ground years after the war was over. And innocent women who were going out to find water for their families, young kids playing in the field, would step on or be blown apart by one of these weapons. And they hadn't committed any crime to anybody. They were not warriors. They were not engaged in mortal combat on behalf of their country. They were just ordinary folks. They just wanted to, in many cases, whether it was in Mozambique or Cambodia or Guatemala. And we've discovered, for example, that even as the Americans were fighting in the war in Vietnam, far more of their soldiers were being killed by landmines than were being killed by enemy fire, because they were hidden, invisible weapons. And there was an initiative started to, which was unique, and that was to, for the first time, eliminate one of the prime weapons in every country's arsenal. Every country had landmines. Every country had it. Now that was a pretty daunting, and maybe some of you might say, none of their business. And we ended up in Canada taking the lead on that particular issue because we had issued a call for a group of countries to come back to our capital city of Ottawa in 1997 to sign a treaty that would ban the use of landmines. Everybody thought we were nuts. And you'll find that in getting into public service. You're not always admired for your rationality. But we took a chance because we felt that in a way the protection of people had equal weight to the protection of the nation state. Not that one was superior to the other. We were responsible for both. But our job was to say, you know, let's see if there is a different paradigm, a different way of organizing ourselves and looking at ourselves. Well, make the story short, to the surprise of everybody, 120 countries showed up and signed the treaty. And by the way, I want to just take a moment to pay tribute to a former colleague of mine and a former foreign minister of Ukraine, Udovenko, pardon me, who was one of the leaders in the anti-mine movement and led Ukraine into becoming a signatory, because Ukraine was one of the major repositories of landmines in the old Soviet Union. It had a stockpile of 60 to 70 landmines. And he is a very courageous sort of public servant, took the lead, became a friend of mine because we worked together, and he helped lead a small group of countries like ours, and Ukraine, and the Dutch, and the Norwegians, and the Cambodians, and the Chileans. We formed a kind of small group internationally, supported by a much larger group of civil societies, supported by the United Nations and the OECD and other groups. And we got the treaty signed. and it's still in place. And the fatalities have dropped from 80,000 a year to 14,000 a year. And though there's only 2 or 3 in the last major conflict in Syria, it's only Syria that's using landmines. Everybody else has resisted their use. So when people say to me, what can I do to change the world, make it better, make it more peaceful, think a moment about Raphael Lemkin and how he got something started personally, and then grew a group of people around him, mainly students, got a convention, and then inspired another generation that followed him to start putting that principle, that idea into action. Like, what grew out of that particular experience for us is one that I particularly want to talk about today, because again, Ukraine is in a very strategic position. Based on our success in establishing this new treaty, setting out what I call a set of standards of humanity law, protection of people. We were approached by a similar group of lawyers and legal sort of advocates to see if we would undertake to help promote the establishment of an international court of law. Now, we have the International Court of Justice, which dealt with commercial issues. That's fine, that's good. And boundary treaties between countries. It was focused on nation states and the conflicts and legal battles between them. But it had long been a dream that there should be an international court that would judge people based upon their crimes. The crime against humanity, crime of using rape in war, crime of using child soldiers, the crime of genocide and extermination. And again, everybody thought, how is that possible? How will individual countries sign away their sovereignty to actually be subject to an international court that may judge it to be in the right or wrong? Well, again, that same coalition of certain smaller countries, a much larger coalition of individual civil organizations who are becoming increasingly powerful because they're connected by the internet. They can now communicate, organize, mobilize, lobby, get people interested. France, for example, Princess Diana was the lead symbol for the landmines campaign. Very popular celebrity around the world, and everybody listened to her. But the court was a much tougher issue because we were really beginning to do something that had not been done for 300 years. We were beginning to slowly shave away the concept that sovereignty is an indivisible, God-given right. That if I'm elected and my country is sovereign, I can do what the hell I want. We're saying, it doesn't quite work that way. Sovereignty has to be earned. It's not God-given. It's not divinely inspired. It's given by the degree to which you serve people. And that's the thought that's really beginning to emerge internationally. And the court, the international court, is the only new international institution the world's been able to devise since the turn of the century, since our new millennium. So that your generation, so far, doesn't have a great track record. Now, you're early, you're young, you got a lot to do, but the only real significant way in which we've been able to advance the cause of human rights is to get a court, an international court, that's able, from time to time, to call in Milosevic, who was responsible for the murder that went on in Serbia and Kosovo, or Taylor, who was the president of Liberia, who murdered millions of people for the sake of gold and diamonds, Menango, who was the leader in the eastern Congo who was responsible for the rape of tens of thousands of women. Slowly they are being arrested and brought to Geneva and held accountable and will be punished for their crimes. The International Court doesn't believe in capital punishment, but they will be imprisoned and held accountable. Now think about this for a moment. You're all interested in public service. How do you hold somebody with the immense power of the public institution accountable? What's the way in which you can say power is not for yours, for yourself personally, it's for providing goods and services and support for the people who get you there? Well, that's what the International Court does. It does it in a very narrow context. It said if somebody, the government is the predator and murders its own people, then it will be charged in front of the International Court and held accountable. Now that's a huge step forward, and the reason I want to bring it to you because you're all going into public service. And I can't think of anybody in public service today that doesn't be conscious of the issue of accountability and how you use your place, position, and power. And the court has really focused on the most extreme possibilities. But then again, it sets a standard, right? It's here. It's just saying that my responsibility is to protect people. Protect people against, as in the case of what happened in Ukraine in the 30s, famine. Stalin and his government were basically starving people to death. And who was responsible for holding him accountable? Well then, no one. Today, 2013, there's an international institution that says that Stalin could never get away with that again and be impugned with any impunity. He would be charged. He would be investigated. He'd be held up to account. That's a huge progress to have been made in the field of public service and public administration. One reason I want to mention it, and I won't talk much longer, is that one of the missions I have in my time here in Ukraine is to encourage your country to now ratify the International Criminal Court Statute. It was signed. Again, I go back to my friend, Udivenko. It was signed. So Ukraine is already a signatory, but the next step is to have the parliament ratify it. Then it becomes a full member. It then means that any resident of Ukraine can be held accountable. International criminals cannot hide here. And it becomes a leader. And why I think it's important is because of the history of this country. A country that has tragically experienced one of the worst forms of human violence and against other people. And that itself must work in the history and in the culture and the ideas of people about how something so horrendous could happen to a grandmother or a great aunt. Well, there's one way to expunge it, to get rid of it, and that is to do something about it. And to make sure that Ukraine takes the lead inside the international court system to ensure that it will never happen again. One final thought. After the court, my government became involved in the conflict in Kosovo. We were very active at the United Nations in the Balkans because there was just, again, too many innocent people. 10,000 people in Srebrenica sort of taken away into a mining cave and murdered. We were also around at the time of Rwanda. I know these are historical incidents, but when you think about 1 million people being murdered in their beds in this small African country, you're saying, that can't happen in this day and age. We're not uncivilized, we're not barbarians. You can't let 1 million people be murdered simply because they belong to a different tribe. Well, it happened. wasn't just because there wasn't a court, it was also because most countries were very reluctant to intervene. Why? Because sovereignty, that big, big word, stands out in neon lights, and we say, hey, you can't involve yourself in somebody else's affairs. Except can you not when people are being murdered? And that was the question that the issue of human security really posed to us. And we really felt that at some point, when enough people are being killed and enough people are being exterminated, it's up to the international community to step in. And one of the things that I worked on in my last years in foreign affairs was to establish a commission and to establish an idea. And if you want to write it down or think about it, you can, you don't have to, but it will have, you should, because it will have more and more impact. It's called the responsibility to protect. And it basically says that our government, that calls itself sovereign, basically has this responsibility to protect its citizens. And if it can't protect its citizens against warlords or those who would do it damage, or if it's too weak to provide that protection, or maybe it's the predator itself, then the international community must take some responsibility to stop the conflict. You can prevent it, I'm not saying you have to go to war to do it, but in Kosovo, we did. We intervened militarily, and it was tough to do. But coming out of that, we have now established an international precedent that, again, that sovereignty is limited. It's not given without restraint. There are prescriptions to it. And it's a good thing because I think we all want to live in our nation states and are proud of them, but we also have to remember that they can't become monsters either. And that's why the international emergence of humanitarian law, built around the responsibility to protect, says to a predator, if you think you're going to intervene, you're going to have to deal with us. Now, we're not perfect. That intervention took place in Libya. It's not taking place in Syria, because at this point, the Russians control the Security Council, and they will veto any action in Syria. That's still negotiation. I hope to God that it's resolved. But overall, it's changing the way we think. It's changing the way we act, and it's certainly changing the way that governments must behave. And so human rights, the fundamental right of people to be protected, the fundamental right to have them protected against risk, is beginning to emerge as one of the most important counterpoints to the old traditional Westphalian sovereignty idea. I'm not saying that one is disappearing. I'm just simply saying that there's now a competitor. There's a new set of laws and rules and practices and people and organizations out there slowly beginning to argue that we have to govern ourselves by a human security principle, not by a national security principle exclusively. And you are going to be in an incredibly important position. It will be the young men and women I'm looking at and occupying places in the government of Ukraine who are going to have to make decisions based upon which side of that coin are you on. Accountability, rule of law, human rights, or simply that power makes right. Tough choice, but a fascinating one. And one I think that particularly, I think that institutions like this, my own university, universities around the world, have to get busy and start thinking about it and start discussing it and debating it and encouraging it so that we understand much better how it works, that we have students who are going in to serve their country, to be patriots, to be civil servants, who come with it understanding that there are now choices to be made. That's what's exciting for me about what you're doing. You have choices to be made. And I wish you well. Thank you very much. So if you want to ask a question or if you want to throw, well, there's no soft buns on the table, but if you want to make a comment, please do.
Okay.
Sure. Do you mind telling me your name? And,
Yes, my name is Yana, and I want to ask you about the Ukrainian diaspora. Maybe do you know Ukrainians who took a high position in public service in Canada, who served to Canada?
yes, we had recently a gentleman of Canadian-Ukrainian origin who served as the Governor General of Canada, which is the highest post in the country. It is like being he represents the Queen in Canada. We still have a part of it. And Ray Natishan was very instrumental in serving the interest, but also was very kindly and open and disposed towards Ukraine. As you know, we have close to 1.5 million Canadians who owe their heritage to Ukraine and are very active. My friend Bill Ballin, who works with me as a vice president of our university, is very active in the Ukrainian-Canadian community. We have had a premier of the province of Saskatchewan, Roy Romanow, who comes from a Ukrainian background.
Lawrence Decor, Mayor.
A former friend of mine, Lawrence Decor, who tragically died a few years ago, was the one who first introduced me to Ukraine, asked me to come when I was in government to see what we could do. And so in government, we have a president. I'm one of those, and I make this confession, I belong to the Liberal Party of Canada, which was a governing party for a long time, the party of Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Kretschmer. We didn't make it in the last election, so we're kind of on sabbatical right now. But one of the most important members of Parliament is Boris Shisnowski from Toronto. Smart, wonderful young man. He will be a leader of our party within a few years. So it's growing up, and they also are very good hockey players, wonderful dancers, good administrators for universities. The Ukrainian diaspora plays a very important role in the emergence of Canada. They also play a very important role in maintaining good connections and relationships in Ukraine. We had dinner last night with one of a Canadian of Ukrainian background who has been working in Ukraine for 20 years, both in government and as a lawyer. Fascinating that he feels very comfortable and he wants to continue that relationship. So it is a community with enormous amount of riches, and both in culture, politics, business, and I grew up with most of them because I grew up on the north end of Winnipeg. And I was hoping to use my vernacular in Ukraine, but Mr. Ballin told me that this is a public audience and it would not go down too well. So, you're welcome. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Olga Reshitova. I represent the International Relations Department, and I just want to come back to the Convention on Genocide, which you described earlier. It was passed by the UN in the beginning of the century, and the language in this convention causes a lot of controversy, which is widely used by international lobbyists in the UN. I mean, it's just a question of your opinion. It's not exactly an answer, but while it was a real pain to pass, to agree on the genocide in Rwanda, it's way harder in Syria, and it definitely won't be considered a genocide in this case. The lobby pressure causes UN to shift from one decision to another and to escape kind of political justice in this issue. So while we have UN solving this in real terms of legal agreements. Why do we need the International Court of Law, and what would cause a political conundrum in this case, like to have a multitude of organizations dealing with this issue?
Thank you. A lot of questions together. I'll try to do my best, but the setting up the court, we felt that we wanted to retain as much as possible the legitimacy of the domestic court system. We didn't think that there had to be one big central court for the world. We wanted to encourage the development of local courts, domestic courts, to deal with questions of international crime. But we did need a central court of appeal in order to provide that, just like any domestic court system, you can go to a lower court, to a court of general appeal, and then you go to an appeal court. So that's really the basis on which the international court is built. That if a country is able to take the Rome Statute, which is the international treaty, and implement it in its own court system. I will give you one example. In Canada, when we signed the Rome Statute, and I was still the minister, I simply wrote the Rome Statute into our criminal code. So automatically our courts are going to have to deal with it. Some countries have done that, others haven't. But it really meant that our own court system was going to have to deal with international crime to begin with. Secondly, we wanted to make sure that there was plenty of room for individual countries to take actions without feeling that the court was going to come breathing down their neck. So there is what I would call a lot of preventative actions that can be taken by the court. You can send observers, you can provide a legal note, you can let them know that this country, country X, is committing international crimes and they better stop it. So it's not, it's not a group of people in black helicopters flying in with their guns ready. It takes a while. But at the same time, we recognize that too often court systems are overly influenced by the central governments in their own countries. And we didn't want it that a president of a country could be immune. So in the case of Sudan, the International Court indicted the president of Sudan. That was a very big step. He didn't like it very much. But what's it done? It means that the president of Sudan, he still goes free because he makes it very careful that he doesn't go into countries that have ratified the treaty. And by the way, one reason I would hope Ukraine would ratify is so that this would not be a country that a thug like Bashir could come to. Pardon my language, but that's... And if you didn't have that, then the system wouldn't work because there wouldn't be that overriding overview that the International Court provides. So that's why there is a central court. But if local courts, domestic courts, national courts want to deal with the issue of international crime, then they should be the court of first response, and the court in The Hague should be the court of last response. And it will also be a way of allowing courts to learn about the issue of international crime against genocides, the use of rape, the use of children for soldiers, things which are now international crimes. If I can be bold enough, and I think we're in a small room and we're not going to be broadcast or anything, one of the reasons that I belong to a UN committee that gives advice to the International Court. One reason why this year there is a special focus on Ukraine to ratify is because we feel that with the historical experience of Ukraine, with the Holodomor, that was a rare experience. It would be important to bring Ukraine in with that experience, to be able to speak to it, to be able to provide its historical understanding, and hopefully, I can't speak for it, begin to talk about whether enforced famine is an international crime that should be introduced into the Rome Statute, that it becomes a crime against humanity. Because when you think of it now, and I'm going to digress for just a minute, with the impact of global warming and climate change, it may not affect Ukraine too much right now, but other countries are dying as a result. Countries whose arable land is being burnt and where there is no water. One of the reasons, by the way, that you find such a conflict in the Middle East is there's no water. They're running out of water, and it's one of the sources of difficulty. But if you made that a crime, if you made it a crime to use famine as a weapon, as they did in Sudan and Darfur and southern Sudan, if that was a crime, then you would find a lot fewer generals and foreign ministers using it than they do. And there's only one country that can really speak knowledgeably to that, and that's your own country. That's why I think it's so important to become part of the system. Yes, sir.
Mr. Ексуорсі, first off, let me thank you for your presentation, preaching content. In my question to you, I would love to get back to the events as of today. Mr. Kovlasuk said in his introduction speech that, you signed a cooperation agreement. It would be, I don't know, I would be thankful for you if you just threw some light on it and just disclose the principles or key points your cooperation with us is focused around.
Cooperation between countries or between universities? We've done both.
Yeah, between universities.
Between universities? Oh, yeah, okay. I think this could be interesting to you. We have a master's degree in development. And it is designed, along with 20 other universities, to really develop a new profession of development, to get a much more rigorous training in both applied and academic education. It was sponsored by the MacArthur Foundation, it's a very large U.S. foundation. And they felt they were given a report by Jeffrey Sachs, who's a very well-known economist, who said that much of the development that goes on in the world is not very disciplined, it's not rigorous. We need to have a much better professional set of tools and guidelines. So they put out a competition, and our University of Winnipeg won one of the spots. There's only 20 across the world. So we won to be a part of that network. So that means that we have connections now with 19 other universities around the world where we offer, in a way, a basic common curriculum on public health, on management, on natural resources, and on social development. And our students actually get on the internet every week, a common classroom that comes from New York or London or wherever they get some big expert. So they have a real common understanding of some of the basic principles or precepts. But then each university is allowed to focus in on very specific areas of development that need to be properly researched and properly taught. So our focus, because we're Canadians and we have a large number of what we call Aboriginal, First Nation, Native, Inuit people, we focus on the problems faced by traditional societies and being able to work up an effective development program. So that's not our exclusive interest, it's our special interest. We are part of this larger network around the world. We've now had 3 years of it. Our students they're expected to do field work in 2 of those years, and they work on everything from a large company that is doing a development in Sri Lanka to working with an NGO that's trying to do a food security program in India, to a group of working in northern Canada to deal with the Arctic meltdown of the ice and to work on problems of climate change, to inner city work, working with poor children in inner city slums. But they all come together to get their master's degree. They're both international and domestic. And we have found it to be an incredible, mind-blowing experience for them. They really get not only the discipline, but they get the experience of students working in 20 other universities. They get the experience of a field occupation. And I'm confident that when we give them their master's degree, set them out in the world, they're going to be really good at what they do. And I indicated that one of the reasons we're in Ukraine is to see if we can work out cooperations with some of the institutions here. We met with KIP earlier this morning. We're meeting with 2 other universities today and tomorrow, and then another in Lvov. I mean, we're trying to see if there's an interest in working on these kind of cooperative networks or exchanges, because I happen to believe, and I learned the hard way, in a way that I was a foreign minister for a number of years, and I learned Canadians don't have all the wisdom. There's a lot of smart people in the rest of the world. We better learn from them too, and we better get around and find out what they're doing. And I want at my own university, I want our students to do that. I want our faculty to do that. I want your people from your faculty to come to mine and talk about public service and what it means in today's world. So I think that's the way of the world. I don't think any of us can live any longer inside just our own boundaries. I think we have to sort of transcend those boundaries. We have to, we can always have our local loyalties, but if we don't sort of start dealing in a broad network, we're not going to be able to make the changes we need to make, because the problems we face are not local. Epidemics are not local. Natural disasters are not local. Drug cartels are not local. Violence and crime are not local. They cross boundaries. And if we don't find a way to work cross boundaries, we're not going to find many solutions to them. That pretty much exhausts our gig. Okay, thanks very much. Enjoyed it.